I don't think the most powerful stories in our lives are the ones we've been told. I think they're the ones we've been quietly telling ourselves for years, without ever realizing they were stories. We call them reality, and that's what makes them so powerful. I've been carrying that thought around for weeks, not particularly because I was preparing for this podcast, not because I was reading another book. Life has a way of placing a question in front of you that refuses to leave. And this has been one of those questions for me. It's followed me into conversations. It's followed me driving in silence. It's sat beside me while I've watched my boys play. It's been with me while I've been coaching. One night, it even found me lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The more I sat with it, the more I realized I wasn't actually thinking about my past. I was thinking about the meanings I'd carried forward from it. Because the older I get, the less interested I become in simply asking what happened. I've become much more interested in asking, what did I decide it meant? Those are not the same question. One gives you the event, the other begins revealing the life that was quietly built afterwards. I'm Raquel, and this is the Actioned Woman. Today, I want to share one of those first discoveries. And this is not because I think I have life figured out. I certainly do not. I am still discovering these ideas myself. But every now and then, you come across something that changes the way you see everything that came before it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And this has become one of those discoveries for me. It changed the way I understand identity, the way I understand motherhood, ambition, pain, purpose, the women that I coach, and ultimately, the life we're all building. I've started calling it the meaning layer. And before I tell you what that is, I do believe I have to tell you where I found it, because I didn't discover this idea in a classroom. I didn't discover it in a psychology textbook. I discovered it while trying to understand my own life. Something changes as you get older, at least it has for me. When I was younger, if someone asked me about a difficult season of my life, I would tell them what happened. Today, I find myself answering a much different question. Not what happened, but what did I believe it meant? I didn't know at the time that those were different questions. Now I think they may be two of the most important questions we can ask, because one tells the story of the event. The other tells the story that quietly grew from the event, and those are not always the same story. Basketball wasn't simply something that I loved. Looking back now, I think it was the first place I ever learned who I was. It held my confidence, my dreams, my future. Without realizing it, I had wrapped my identity around something I believed would always be there. When people asked me who I was, I probably wouldn't have answered, I'm a basketball player. But somewhere deep inside, that's exactly who I believed I was. Then came the injuries, one after another, 3 surgeries, years of rehabilitation, years of trying to get back, years of believing that if I just work a little harder, I could somehow return to that future I had already imagined. For a long time, I believed I was grieving basketball. Looking back now, I don't think I was. I think I was grieving the future basketball had been carrying for me. And that's very different. I wasn't mourning a sport. I was mourning an identity. The injuries were real. The surgeries were real. The loss was very real. I've never questioned any of that. What I've questioned is something entirely different. Somewhere inside that experience, I quietly reached a conclusion that sounded something like this. Maybe I failed. Maybe I gave up. Maybe the person I was supposed to become disappeared with those injuries. No surgeon told me that. No coach told me that. No teammate told me that. Life didn't tell me that. I did. I built that meaning. Then I carried it as though it had been handed to me as a fact. That meaning quietly changed the way I saw myself, the way I approached new opportunities, the way I imagined my entire future. It didn't just shape how I felt. It began shaping the decisions I made because of how I felt. Looking back now, I don't think the injury shaped me nearly as much as the meaning I attached to it, and I can't help but wonder, how many of us are carrying meanings that have quietly become reality simply because we've been carrying them for so long? Maybe you've experienced something similar, not my story, yours. Maybe it wasn't a sport. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a business, a friendship, a conversation you never forgot, a comment someone made when you were 12 years old, a disappointment, a betrayal, a dream that didn't unfold the way you imagined. The event happened once. The meaning stayed. And when the meaning stayed, it quietly began influencing the way you interpreted the experiences that followed. That's the part I don't think we talk about enough, because the event becomes part of our history. The meaning quietly begins participating in our future. Life gave me another opportunity to discover that lesson. This time, it came through motherhood. And if I'm honest, I don't think I recognized what was happening until years later. For a long time, I believed the greatest danger of becoming a mother was disappearing inside it. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from what I had absorbed over many years. The women I watched, the stories I heard, the examples that quietly surrounded me. No one ever sat me down and said, one day you'll have to choose. No one said, you can build a meaningful career or you can build a meaningful family, but eventually one of them has to give. Yet somehow that belief found its way into me anyway. Looking back, I don't think I entered motherhood. I entered an argument. An argument I didn't even realize I was having. One side of me believed motherhood would deepen my life. The other believed I had to prove it wouldn't erase me, and that changed everything. Because I wasn't simply raising children, I was trying to defend an identity. Every goal became evidence. Every accomplishment became proof. Proof that I had not disappeared. Proof that I could still build. Proof that I could still create. Proof that I could still matter. From the outside, that probably looked like ambition. Inside me, it often felt like defense. And there's a difference. I loved building. I loved coaching. I loved writing. I loved dreaming. None of those things were the problem. The problem was the meaning I had attached to them. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that succeeding meant proving I hadn't lost myself. The work hadn't changed. Motherhood hadn't changed. My dreams hadn't changed. The meaning had. And because the meaning changed, the life I was building from it changed too. I didn't know it then, but that realization would eventually lead me to one of the most important discoveries I've ever made. Not immediately. Actually, it took years of coaching women, years of watching patterns repeat, years of looking back over my own life, years of asking questions that refused to leave me alone. Because once I recognized that basketball wasn't only about basketball and motherhood wasn't only about motherhood, I couldn't stop asking myself something. What else have I mistaken for reality? That question has followed me everywhere, into coaching sessions, into conversations, into my marriage, into business, into the way that I parent, into the way I responded when life did not unfold the way I expected. Because I started noticing something. The event would happen, and almost immediately, something else would happen. Something invisible. So invisible, I think most of us miss it completely. I think one of the greatest misconceptions we carry as human beings is that life changes us. I've started wondering if that's actually true. Because if it were, wouldn't the same experience produce the same person every single time? Wouldn't every woman who experienced divorce arrive at the same conclusion? Wouldn't every athlete whose career ended become the same woman? Wouldn't every mother experience motherhood in exactly the same way? Wouldn't every entrepreneur whose business failed once stop trying? But that's not what we see. We see one woman become bitter, another becomes compassionate, one woman closes herself off, and another becomes more open. One woman decides life cannot be trusted, another decides life has invited her to begin again. The event wasn't different. The woman wasn't necessarily stronger. So what happened? What happened between the event and the life that was eventually built? Because something happened there, something invisible, something so immediate, most of us never notice it. Imagine two women standing beside one another. They both lose their jobs on the same day. One quietly thinks, I knew I wasn't good enough. The other quietly thinks, maybe this is the beginning of something I would never have chosen for myself. Same event, different future. Imagine two little girls. Both forget the words during a school presentation. One quietly decides, I'm terrible at speaking in front of people. The other laughs, sits back down, and forgets about it by dinner. Same moment, different confidence, different identity. Imagine two women becoming mothers. One quietly believes, I have to choose between the woman I was and the mother I'm becoming. Another believes, motherhood is going to ask me to become more of who I really am. Same season, different future. The more I sat with those questions, the more I realized something. The event alone couldn't explain the difference. If it could, the same experience would always build the same person. It doesn't, which means something else is participating in the construction of our lives, not years later, immediately. Then one day, it finally clicked. Perhaps we don't simply live from our experiences. Perhaps we live from what those experiences come to mean. And that thought completely stopped me because it explained something I've been trying to understand for years. Not why life is hard, but why the same life can shape two people so differently. I don't think we create meaning because we're weak. I think we create meaning because uncertainty is incredibly difficult to live inside. Human beings want to understand. We want to predict. We want to make sense of what just happened. We want to know whether we're safe, whether we're enough, whether we should move towards something or away from it. So almost immediately after an experience, our minds begin asking a question, not consciously, almost automatically. What does this mean? What does this mean about me? What does this mean about my future? What does this mean about love, about trust, about failure, about success, about the kind of woman I am? The remarkable thing is usually we answer those questions before we even realize we've asked them. And then we forget we answered them at all. The interpretation becomes familiar. The familiar becomes normal. Eventually, it stops feeling like an interpretation. It starts feeling like reality. I think that's one of the greatest illusions we live inside. The most powerful stories in our lives are often the ones we never realized were stories. We mistook them for facts. That's when I finally had language for what I'd been seeing for years. There is an invisible place. Every experience passes through a place between what happens and the life that eventually grows from what happened. I've started calling that place the meaning layer. The meaning layer is where an experience becomes an interpretation, where interpretation becomes emotion, where emotion begins influencing decisions, where repeated decisions begin shaping identity, and where identity quietly begins building a life. Every future begins somewhere. I've come to believe it often begins there, inside the meaning we quietly attach to an experience years ago. Because meanings don't simply influence the way we think. They influence what feels possible. They shape what we expect. They influence what we notice, what we avoid, what we defend, what we believe we are capable of. And without realizing it, those meanings begin participating in our decisions. Think about it. If somewhere along the way I concluded I'm not good enough, that meaning doesn't simply stay inside my thoughts. It changes the decisions I make. Maybe I stop applying for opportunities. Maybe I settle. Maybe I overwork to prove myself. Maybe I never speak up. Maybe I choose relationships that reinforce what I already believe. The meaning doesn't force those decisions, but it does influence what feels natural. Now imagine making those decisions not once, but hundreds of times, thousands of times. Eventually, those repeated decisions begin building a life, your life. That's why I don't believe our future is only shaped by our circumstances. I think it's also shaped by the meanings we've been carrying into those circumstances. And that's a profound difference because circumstances happen. Meanings continue participating. That's why the meaning layer matters, not just in this conversation, but in our lives, because it's not another interesting concept, because it's the place where tomorrow quietly begins being built. Every interpretation becomes a lens. Every lens influences a decision. Every decision places another brick by brick, meaning by meaning. a life begins taking shape. That's why I keep coming back to one sentence. It becomes one of the foundational principles of my teachings in the life architecture. The event becomes history. The meaning becomes architecture. History tells us what happened. Architecture influences what happens next. History deserves to be honored. We don't pretend painful things didn't happen. We don't minimize grief. We don't rewrite loss. But history and architecture are not the same thing. History belongs to the past. Architecture participates in the future. That's why two people can honor the exact same painful experience and still build completely different lives afterwards. Not because one person ignored what happened, because each person continued building from a different meaning. When that realization first landed, I remember sitting with one thought. If that's true, then I've been trying to change my life in the wrong place for years. I focused on changing my behavior, be more confident, stop overthinking, be more disciplined, work harder, rest more. All of those things, they matter. But what I started wondering, what if behavior isn't where architecture begins? What if behavior is simply revealing the architecture that's already there? Because suddenly, I stopped looking at behavior as the problem. I started seeing it as evidence. Evidence that something underneath deserved my attention. Imagine walking into an old house. You notice a crack running across one of the walls, and almost immediately, most of us think, how do I fix that crack? But a builder asks a different question. Why did it appear? Because painting over the crack might make the wall look different. It won't change what caused it. I started believing our lives work the same way. Patterns are evidence. Habits are evidence. Emotions are evidence. The way we react under pressure is evidence. The way we speak to ourselves is evidence. None of those things appear out of nowhere. They're pointing us towards something underneath, toward a meaning we've been building from. And if that's true, then perhaps lasting change doesn't begin by fighting behavior. Perhaps it begins by becoming conscious of the architecture that behavior has been revealing all along. That was the moment I realized something. Awareness isn't the renovation. Awareness is the moment you finally see the house. Before awareness, the architecture simply feels like reality. You don't question it, you build from it. But the moment you recognize this is a meaning and not necessarily this is the truth, something extraordinary happens. For the first time, choice becomes possible. And I think that's where real change begins. That was the moment something shifted for me. And it wasn't because I suddenly had all the answers, but it was because for the first time, I knew where to start looking. Looking back, I wasn't changing my life. I was trying to change the behaviors my life was producing. I wasn't changing the architecture. I was repainting the walls. And eventually, I realized something. You cannot renovate a house by decorating rooms that were built on foundations you never questioned. You have to understand what the house has been built from. I've started believing something. Behavior isn't the root. Behavior is the fruit. For so many years, I thought my behaviors were the problem. If I could become more disciplined, more confident, less anxious, more productive, that everything else would eventually fall into place. Now I don't think that's where lasting change begins. I've been thinking about trees. When a tree isn't healthy, we don't blame the leaves. We don't paint them greener. We don't tie healthier leaves onto the branches and hope no one notices. We go underneath. We ask, what's feeding this tree? I've started asking that same question about my own life. Not, why do I keep doing this? But what meaning has been feeding this pattern? Because behaviors don't usually appear out of nowhere. They're growing from something. And more often than not, what they are growing from lives inside the meaning layer. That really changed everything because I stopped trying to fight every behavior. I started becoming curious about the meaning producing it. That curiosity changed the questions I asked. Instead of asking, how do I become more confident? I found myself asking, what meaning has made confidence feel so difficult? Instead of asking, why do I keep proving myself? I began asking, what am I still trying to prove and why? Those are, again, very different questions because one tries to change the fruit, the other begins understanding the root. I've also been thinking about old houses, not because I know anything about construction, but because I think they tell us something about our lives and about ourselves. Imagine walking into a house that's been standing for 100 years. The walls have always been there. The rooms have always been arranged the same way. The staircase has always turned in that direction. If you grew up inside that house, you probably never stopped and asked why. You'd simply assume that's what houses look like until someone walks through the front door, looks around, and asks, why is this wall here? At first, the question almost sounds a bit ridiculous because the walls, they've always been here. Then another question follows. Is it actually holding the house up? Or have you simply lived beside it for so long, you've forgotten to question it? Because not every wall is load-bearing. Some walls solved a problem that no longer exists. Some walls were built for a family that lived there 50 years ago. Some walls made perfect sense for another season, but no longer serve the life that's trying to be lived today. I wonder if our inner lives work the exact same way. How many beliefs have we mistaken for load-bearing walls? I have to prove myself. Rest has to be earned. Success determines my worth. If I disappoint people, they'll leave. If I slow down, I'll fall behind. We've carried those beliefs for so long, they no longer feel like beliefs. They feel like reality until awareness quietly walks through the front door, looks around, and asks, does this still belong here? I think that's why awareness changes everything. Not because awareness changes your life overnight, it doesn't. But because awareness separates something we've been experiencing as one thing, the event and the meaning. Before awareness, they're fused together. The interpretation feels like truth. After awareness, they become distinguishable. And once they are distinguishable, they become examinable. You can become curious. You can ask, is this the only meaning available? Did I choose this meaning? Or did I inherit it? Does this meaning still help me build the life I'm trying to build? Those questions don't renovate the house, but they do unlock the front door. Because you cannot renovate architecture until you can finally see it. That realization changed the way I looked at motherhood. For years, I thought I was exhausted because I was trying to do too much. Looking back now, I don't think that was the deepest reason. The deeper exhaustion came from the meaning I was building from. Somewhere along the way, I had quietly decided that motherhood meant I had to prove I hadn't disappeared. That meaning didn't change how much I loved my boys. It changed the relationship I had with everything else. Every accomplishment had another job. It wasn't enough to simply build something meaningful. Every achievement also had to answer a question it was never designed to answer. Am I still enough? No accomplishment can answer that question permanently. That's why proving is so exhausting. It asks every success to carry the weight of your identity. And eventually, everything begins competing with everything else. Your marriage competes with your career. Your career competes with your children. Your children compete with your health. Rest competes with productivity. Presence competes with achievement. Not because those things are actually in conflict. They're not. Because the meaning you're building from has placed them there. That's what systems and survival do. They organize life around protection. Protection of identity. Protection of worth. Protection of belonging, protection of certainty. Every meaningful part of your life begins asking the same question: how do I make sure I don't lose? Eventually, life begins feeling like one long negotiation, one constant attempt to keep every plate spinning, not because life is asking that of you, because the meaning underneath it is doing that. Looking back, I wasn't changing my life. I was changing the meaning I was building it from. And when that meaning changed, every relationship inside my life began changing with it. That was the discovery. The work didn't change. Motherhood didn't change. My marriage didn't change. My boys didn't change. My business didn't change. The meaning did. And when the meaning changed, the architecture had no choice but to begin changing too. Because meaning organizes life. If the meaning is proving, life organizes itself around proving. If the meaning is fear, life organizes itself around protection. If the meaning is scarcity, life organizes itself around holding on. If the meaning is purpose, life begins organizing itself around contribution. That's why changing meaning changes everything. Not because the circumstances disappear, because the architecture they're building begins to change. Then one day, I stopped asking, how do I prove I can do it all? I started asking, what would it look like to build from purpose instead? Because purpose doesn't force every part of your life into competition. Purpose begins placing things into relationship. My marriage doesn't compete with my work. It shapes the woman my work is building. It reminds me that success isn't measured only by what I accomplish. It's also measured by who I'm becoming while I accomplish it. My boys don't compete with my ambition. They transform the reason I have ambition in the first place. They remind me that the life I'm building isn't measured only by what I create. It's measured by the people who experience that life with me. My business doesn't compete with my family. It has become one of the ways I live the values I hope my boys grow up watching. Integrity, courage, contribution, service, building something that matters. Do you see what's actually changed? Nothing external. Marriage didn't change. My boys, they didn't change. My business didn't change. The meaning changed. Because when the meaning changed, the relationship between every part of my life changed. Nothing was competing anymore. Everything began serving the same life. That's what purpose does. Purpose organizes, not because it removes responsibility, not because it makes life easier, because purpose asks a different question. Instead of asking which part of my life has to win, it asks, how do these parts belong together? That one question changes everything. It no longer sees marriage and ambition as competitors. It sees each shaping the other. It no longer sees motherhood and purpose as opposites. It sees motherhood deepening purpose. It no longer sees work as proof that you're enough. It sees work as one expression of what matters most. That's why purpose organizes. It doesn't ask every meaningful part of your life to defend its place. It asks every meaningful part of your life to contribute to the same whole. Systems and survival divide. Purpose integrates. System and survival ask, what do I have to defend? Purpose asks, what am I trying to build? And that's a completely different life. That realization has humbled me in more ways than I can even say, because it made me ask questions I never considered before. How many goals have become proving grounds instead of expressions of purpose? How many dreams had become evidence instead of invitations? How many moments had I mistaken urgency for importance? How many decisions had I made simply because they fit the meaning I'd been carrying? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how much of my life had I been calling reality when I was actually living inside an interpretation? Those questions continue changing me, not because they always give me immediate answers, because they remind me that every single day I'm building. Every conversation, every decision, every interpretation, every act of courage, every act of fear, another brick is being placed. The difference now is that I'm paying attention to what I'm building from. The difference now is that I'm building consciously. Maybe that's all life architecture really is. Learning to become conscious of what you've been building from before another year quietly becomes another wall. Because I don't think we're simply living our lives. I think we're constantly building them, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. Every experience asks a question. Every one of us answers it, sometimes with hope, sometimes with fear, sometimes with courage, sometimes with protection, sometimes without even realizing we've answered it at all. Those answers become meanings. Those meanings begin organizing the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people, the way we see what's possible, and eventually they begin organizing the life we build. That's why I've come to believe something very deeply. The meaning layer isn't just another idea. It's where the architect works, and whether we realize it or not, we are all architects. Every interpretation places another brick. Every conclusion shapes another room. Every meaning influences the next decision. And little by little, a life begins taking shape, one meaning at a time. I began today by saying something that's been following me around for weeks. I don't think the most powerful stories in our lives are the ones we've been told. I think they're the ones we've been quietly telling ourselves without ever realizing they were stories. After everything we've explored together today, I believe that even more, because those stories don't simply shape the way we think. They shape the way we build. They shape what feels impossible, what feels worth protecting, what feels worth pursuing, what feels impossible. They influence the decisions we make, often long before we realize we are making them. That's why this conversation matters to me. Not because I want you to leave today questioning every belief you've ever had. I hope you leave today noticing something. Notice the meanings you've been carrying. Noticing the stories that have slowly become reality. Noticing the architecture you've been building one interpretation at a time. Because maybe the most powerful thing we'll ever build, it isn't a business, it isn't a career, it isn't confidence. Maybe the most powerful thing we'll ever build is meaning. Because meaning becomes identity. Identity influences decisions. Decisions become architecture. And architecture becomes a life. So this week, don't try to change your whole life. Just notice it. Notice how quickly your mind answers the question. What does this mean? Notice which meanings feel so familiar. They no longer feel like meanings at all. They simply feel like reality. Those moments matter because every renovation begins the same way, not with a hammer, with awareness. My hope isn't that you leave today with all of the answers. My hope is that you leave asking a better question. What have I been building from? Because if meaning can be built, meaning can be rebuilt. And if meaning can be rebuilt, then perhaps a life can too. Thank you for spending this time with me. This conversation has been one of the most personal I've shared, not because I've told you everything that's happened in my life, but because I've shared one of the discoveries that changed the way I understand it. This is one of the first discoveries inside life architecture. And there are many, many more rooms we'll walk through together. Many more walls we'll question. Many more discoveries we'll make. But I couldn't think of a better place to begin. Until next time, keep building consciously.